Hey everyone, and welcome to another Raw review of Kill All Games. While I know in my last one I said that I probably wouldn't be doing any more of these going forward, I felt for The Thing Remastered, there wasn't necessarily enough content for me to justify writing out a full script. The game is very short, clocking in at less than 5 hours, and because of the legacy of the game, this being a 22-year-old product at this point, what's more interesting to me is the history behind it and the decisions that didn't quite pan out in the final game. If you're worried that Nightdive's remastering efforts are bad or somehow this new version is lackluster, I mean, it's not. Nightdive rarely puts out anything that has major issues on day one, and even if there are some problems, they tend to get patched pretty quickly. So, to sum this up really briefly for anyone who's wondering whether or not The Thing Remastered is good, it is. Now for the game itself, I do have some problems, and I want to talk about those more in depth in the actual review segment. I'm also going to give some history of the game because its development reveals some of the problems that I have with the game itself. It even echoes some of the criticisms that were present 22 years ago from reviewers. Let's get into things. Development of the 2002 Thing video game started in the year 2000 when Universal began looking through its back catalog for ways to expand into the games industry. While the industry itself wasn't held as in high regard as it is now, Universal felt there was some lucrative possibilities there for adapting its different film franchises. The Thing was obviously the one they felt the strongest about, hence why we have the game. And it makes perfect sense. The atmosphere of the movie and the very idea of a monster infecting you and you not knowing it is completely ripe for a survival horror game. So that's where developer Computer Artworks came in. They wanted to run with that idea and capture the atmosphere of the film where its characters didn't quite know who to trust or where the monsters were lurking. Now, in practice with the game, this works in a way where you can recruit NPCs and command them to do different things based on their class. The class system has a soldier, an engineer, and a medic. And you have a very simple command menu to, say, have the engineer go repair something, or have the soldier stand guard, or have the medic heal different teammates or yourself. It all works intuitively in the game, even if the menu is a little clunky, and that gives you some kind of companionship with your NPC allies. Where the issues start to crop up, and this was actually a common criticism back in the day, is that a lot of these mechanics don't feel quite fleshed out. So the original idea for that game was that it was going to be more open world based, and there was even a possibility that every single NPC in the game could turn into a thing at any moment. The developers wanted this to be randomized so that new playthroughs of the game would be fresh. In a Eurogamer retrospective published in 2014, original programmer Diarmuid Campbell explained, "The infection system was conceived as a simulation that had the capacity to play out differently each time you played the game, leading to potential replayability. However, the game was also very story-led with set pieces that required specific characters getting infected at certain times. These two aspects were constantly pulling in different directions. I think we ended up with a slightly messy compromise with good story elements and a genuinely new mechanic, but also had some logical inconsistencies which, ironically, became glaringly obvious if you played the game more than once." I have to say that's probably the aspect of the thing that I noticed immediately. When I was playing it, and the intro tutorials, which are kind of overbearing, were explaining how certain NPCs can become infected or they will mistrust you and whatnot, I remembered recalling a friend from middle school getting hyped about this very aspect. It's a cool idea to think that your teammates can turn on you and actually kill you if you do things to make them mistrust you, but in practice that doesn't quite matter. While there are certain NPCs that can randomly become the thing, you could easily just curtail that by giving them a ton of ammo and then maxing out their trust. Sure, they might be a thing, but when every NPC dies, they turn into a monster anyway, and if you have them at maximum trust, they're never going to do anything that harms you. So it doesn't pan out in the course of the game. What I do like about the game is it sort of reminded me of 2003's Freedom Fighters, which was developed by IO Interactive. I like the squad-based elements, but it's very arcadey almost. I suppose that was the limitations of PS2 third-person shooters at the time. There wasn't really a codified formula for how to do twin-stick controls on a console back then, and while this new version feels and plays like a modern game, it still has those old design elements and jank incorporated into it. There's no getting around that, regardless of how good Nightdive's Remastered is. At certain times, like the auto-aim is just way too generous, or your allies will just stand right in front of you, and the AI isn't really smart enough to kind of sell the horror aspect. I think The Thing works pretty good as a horror-adjacent shooter. It is mostly an action game, and you get that from the bosses that are these gigantic hulking monstrosities, and it could be fun for a short bit. I like that the game is at least brief, too. If I wanted to replay it and put it on a higher difficulty, which I actually suggest for a first-time playthrough anyway, you know, it wouldn't require much dedication from me. I could honestly blast it out in probably 3 hours now that I know where everything is, and I think that works great as a companion piece to the film, which is also not an overly long experience. It's just that some of the factors that I brought up with the trust system or the NPCs turning into the Thing, I mean, everything's a little too scripted within this game. It presents the basic idea that it wants you to believe, but almost similar to Amnesia: The Dark Descent, it's kind of a lie. For people that don't know, the first Amnesia game blatantly lies to the player that if you stay in the dark too long, you'll go insane. And it's that fear of the unknown that makes you react in a different way. For a first-time playthrough, it's excellent. I mean, you try your best to not stay in the darkness too long, and you try to avoid looking at monsters, and you don't want your character to go nuts, but there is no actual threat. And that's simply because the developer didn't have enough time or experience to really implement what they wanted to. What you need to remember about The Thing is that it was just an old game that was trying to present something new in an industry that at least allowed new ideas. I think that's what really captures me about this playthrough, as it is a first-time playthrough for me. I like that back during the 6th console generation, studios and publishers were more willing to take risks with games rather than nowadays. Now, you could say that The Thing isn't really a risk because it's a known property. It was still a big risk to present The Thing as a survival horror game. Sure, that makes sense with the theme of the movie, but survival horror games were falling out of favor around the turn of the millennium. Resident Evil famously became more action, and while Resident Evil 4 is still regarded as a classic, it's not really, retro Resident Evil. It's a brand new style that has horror elements but puts more emphasis on front-facing enemies and getting into the thick of battles. The Thing isn't really like that. I mean, it's a totally different experience, but it is interesting that, most players would think you would just be a cleanup crew going around shooting all of the monsters that infected the original base from the movie. While this game is a direct sequel in that sense, it's nice that the developer at least tried to retain some of the horror atmosphere. I think that's where the style of this game shines. The atmosphere is great. The soundtrack is very good. I mean, the voice acting's okay. It's of its era. I do like that they don't rely too much on celebrity appearances. And for that, I mean, like, Kurt Russell only appears at the very end of the game for 10 seconds. John Carpenter does have an uncredited cameo, and his character is quickly killed off, but it's cool that he had some involvement with this, sort of linking it back to that original movie. Overall, I do think that The Thing is a good game. Nightdive did what it could to improve the experience as much as possible, but there's no getting around some of the flaws inherent with this game's design. For the original vision of computer artworks to be realized, you truly would have to, from the ground up, remake this game. I don't think it necessarily needs cutting-edge new visuals. I actually like what Nightdive did by including specular mapping and dynamic lighting, things like that. But it's just that those gameplay systems are a little faulty. You know, the game's just too easy for its own good, really. And with NPCs being scripted to turn into things at certain points, it kind of robs that shock factor. But overall, The Thing is still a very good game. I'm happy that Nightdive has remastered it and preserved it for new generations. And yeah, there's really not much else I have to complain about. Nightdive's remaster efforts are always great, and this is just another classic to add to the collection. I hope you enjoyed this review for Nightdive's remaster of The Thing. If you're wondering why it's a little late, it's that I didn't get a code before launch. I appreciate that Nightdive CEO Stephen Kick still looked out for me, being now an independent YouTuber, I suppose, but I didn't have time to put something together more substantially. And after playing the game, I'm not really sure what I truly could say. There are different aspects that I could bring up, and I'm sure a fully scripted review might better put my thoughts in like a proper order. But regardless, I like The Thing, I thought it was good, and I appreciate Nightdive. And a very special shout out to Stephen Kick and Nightdive's community manager Morgan Shaver. The two of them have been good to me since I launched this YouTube channel, and I just want to give them a shout out for looking out for me. I also really love that Nightdive continues to preserve older games with subtle improvements that don't dramatically alter the experience. I know they did a System Shock remake, which is a complete ground-up reimagining of that original title, but Nightdive also has an enhanced edition of the original System Shock. If you're not a big fan of modern, fancily overhauled remakes, you can play the original experience on modern platforms, and that's super cool. So, thanks for joining me with this raw review of The Thing. I'm going to stop my rambling and make sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. And until next time.